The dawn did not break over the Pyrenees on the 13th of December, 1813, rather. It seemed to bleed slowly through a suffocating gray shroud of Atlantic mist in the rugged, mud-soaked hills of the Basque country, just miles from the French border. The weather was not merely a backdrop, it was a belligerent participant in the war. For days, the rain had fallen in sheets, a relentless, freezing torrent that turned roads into quagmires and streams into raging killers. But the greatest casualty of this deluge was not a soldier, nor a cannon, but a bridge. To understand the sheer terror of that morning, one must first understand the geography of the disaster. The British Army, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, had done the impossible. They had marched across the Iberian Peninsula, driving the French forces back over the Pyrenees and onto the sacred soil of France itself. But to press the attack against the city of Bayonne, Wellington had been forced to do something he loathed. He had been forced to split his army. The River Nive cut through the theater of operations like a jagged scar. Wellington commanded the forces on the west bank. On the east bank, isolated and exposed, was a smaller wing of the army under the command of his most trusted lieutenant, General Rowland Hill. Connecting them was a single, fragile lifeline, a pontoon bridge engineered to withstand the current. Or so they thought. Sometime in the dark, early hours, the Nive, swollen by the mountain rains, rose with violent speed. The waters surged, carrying debris and timber from the high peaks, and smashed into the pontoon boats. With a groan of timber and iron that might have been heard over the storm, the bridge snapped. The cables parted, the boats drifted away into the dark. And just like that, the British army was severed in two. When the light finally touched the muddy ridge of St. Pierre that morning, the full horror of the situation became apparent. The Duke of Wellington, standing safe on the west bank, raised his telescope. What he saw through the lens must have turned his blood to ice. The bridge was gone, the river was impassable, and 3 miles away across the unbridgeable water, General Hill was alone. But Hill was not just alone, he was being hunted. Marshal Soult, the Duke of Dalmatia, was perhaps the most capable of all Napoleon's marshals remaining in Spain. He was a man of immense experience, a veteran of Austerlitz and Jena, a commander who had tasted the bitter ash of defeat against Wellington before, but who remained a dangerous, prowling predator. Soult knew the terrain, he knew the river. And his scouts had brought him the news of the broken bridge before the British engineers could even attempt a repair. Soult saw the mathematical certainty of the moment. It was a gift from the gods of war. With the British army split, and the river raging between them, Wellington could not move a single man to help his subordinate. The Grand Army of the Pyrenees, the force defending the very gateway to France, could now be concentrated entirely on one single point. Soult did not hesitate. He stripped his defenses elsewhere and massed his entire striking power, nearly 40,000 hardened veterans, backed by heavy artillery and cavalry against Rowland Hill's isolated wing. The plan was simple, brutal, and strategically perfect. Soult would crush Hill's force in a single morning, grinding them into the mud of Saint-Pierre. Once Hill was destroyed, Soult would turn on Wellington, whose flank would now be wide open. It was a maneuver designed to end the invasion of France in a single day. It was a maneuver designed to restore the glory of the empire. On the ridge of St. Pierre, General Rowland Hill looked out into the mist. He was a man unlike the other generals of the era. He possessed none of the fiery temper of Picton, none of the cold, aloof aristocracy of Wellington. The men called him Daddy Hill. He was known for his kindness, his concern for rations and dry boots, his reluctance to spend lives unnecessarily. He was a solid, dependable corps commander, a man who followed orders and held the line, but he had never been asked to fight a battle like this alone. As the fog began to lift in patches, the British sentries on the forward slopes froze. Emerging from the gloom, marching in the grand, terrifying columns that had conquered Europe, was the French army, not a raiding party, not a division. It was an avalanche of blue coats and shakos, stretching as far as the eye could see. The numbers were terrifying. Hill had roughly 14,000 men under his command on the east bank, but they were spread out, covering a perimeter of miles. At the crucial point of impact, on the main road to St. Pierre where the hammer blow would fall, Hill could scrape together only a vanguard. Standing directly in the path of Soult's tens of thousands were roughly 3,500 British infantrymen. This was not a battle, it was an execution waiting to happen. The silence before the first volley was heavy with the weight of impending massacre. The British troops, soaked to the bone, hungry and shivering in the December chill, checked their flints. They looked to their officers, and they looked to the river at their backs. There was no retreat. If the line broke, they would be driven into the swollen waters of the Nive, or butchered where they stood. On the far bank, Wellington could only watch. He was the most powerful soldier in the British Empire, a man who had defeated every French marshal sent against him, yet now he was reduced to a helpless spectator. He paced the riverbank, cursing the engineers, cursing the rain, watching the French columns coalesce like storm clouds on the opposite ridge. He knew better than anyone that no general, no matter how competent, could hold back odds of 5-1 for long. He was watching the seemingly inevitable destruction of his right wing. But Marshal Soult had made a miscalculation. It was a common error made by French commanders throughout the war, a fatal arrogance born of their continental victories. Soult looked at the map, he looked at the numbers, and he assumed that the British general on the hill, this quiet, unassuming country squire, would recognize the hopelessness of his position. He assumed that when the massive columns of French infantry, drums beating the pas de charge, smashed into the thin red line, the British would break. Soult did not understand the man he was fighting, and he did not understand the men standing in the mud alongside him. What was about to unfold on the slopes of Saint-Pierre was not a masterpiece of grand strategy. It was not a battle of sweeping maneuvers or brilliant flanking attacks. It was a brawl. It was a collision of sheer willpower, a test of how much punishment the human spirit could endure. It was a day where the fate of the Peninsular War, and perhaps the fate of Europe, rested not on the genius of Napoleon or the Iron Duke, but on the shoulders of a forgotten general and a few thousand cold, wet men standing on a muddy ridge, refusing to move. The French drums grew louder, rolling like thunder across the valley. The skirmishers popped away in the valley floor, the white smoke of their muskets mingling with the mist. The great blue columns began to ascend the slope. The trap was sprung. The bridge was down. The odds were impossible. By all rights, the history books should record December 13, 1813, as the greatest disaster in the history of the British Army. It should have been the day Rowland Hill died and the invasion of France collapsed. But history is not written by mathematics, it is written by the impossible. And as the first French cannonball plowed into the earth of the ridge, Daddy Hill sat on his horse, calm and composed, ready to give the French marshal a lesson in the stubbornness of the British soldier. The massacre was scheduled to begin. To fully grasp the magnitude of the disaster looming over General Hill on that rain-swept morning, we must lift our gaze from the muddy banks of the River Nive and cast it across the entirety of a bleeding continent. The year 1813 was not merely another turning of the calendar in the endless Napoleonic Wars. It was the hinge upon which the fate of the modern world turned. For nearly 2 decades, Europe had been a blacksmith's forge, hammered incessantly by the ambition of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. But by the late autumn of 1813, the forge had grown cold. The emperor, once the invincible master of battles, was reeling. Only weeks prior to the crisis on the Nive, the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden had inflicted a catastrophic defeat upon him at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. It was a slaughter that shattered French power in Germany and sent the remnants of the Grande Armée streaming back towards the Rhine. To the casual observer, it might have seemed that the war was already won. The Titan was on his knees. But those who knew Napoleon, and those who understood the martial spirit of France, knew better. The emperor was never more dangerous than when he was cornered. As the Allied armies in the East hesitated, bogged down by logistics and the terror of facing Napoleon on his own soil, the eyes of London, Vienna, and Berlin turned south. They turned to the Pyrenees. The British army under the Duke of Wellington had become the tip of the Allied spear. While the massive armies of the East were lumbering giants, Wellington's force was a razor-sharp, disciplined, and undefeated. They had done what no other army had managed. They had marched from the coast of Portugal, across the harsh expanse of Spain, and had kicked open the back door of Napoleon's empire. But crossing the frontier into France changed the nature of the war entirely. This was no longer a war of liberation as it had been in Spain. This was an invasion. The British were now standing on the sacred soil of La Patrie. The psychological stakes were immense. If Wellington could maintain his foothold in southern France, he would drain Napoleon's resources, incite rebellion against the emperor's regime, and prove that France itself was not invulnerable. However, if Wellington were to be defeated here, if his army were to be crushed on the border, the consequences would be catastrophic. The coalition against Napoleon was fragile, held together only by the promise of victory. A major British disaster would send shockwaves through the courts of Europe. It might cause the wavering Austrians to sign a separate peace. It would certainly allow Napoleon to strip the southern border of troops and hurl them north to destroy the Russians and Prussians. The safety of the entire world, therefore, rested on the stability of the line in southern France. And the man charged with breaking that line was no mere functionary. He was Marshal Nicolas Soult. History has perhaps been unkind to Soult, often overshadowing him with the flamboyant bravery of Ney or the tactical brilliance of Devout. But Soult was a formidable creature. He was the Duke of Dalmatia, a hard-bitten, looting, pragmatic soldier who had risen from the ranks to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the empire. He had been sent south by Napoleon with a specific mandate: restore my affairs. Soult was a man with a wounded pride. He had spent years in Spain being outmaneuvered by Wellington, a man he derisively called a sepoy general. But Soult was also a master of organization. In the months leading up to December, he had performed a miracle. He had taken the broken, demoralized wreckage of the French armies fleeing Spain and reforged them into a fighting force. He had conscripted fresh youth, hardened the veterans, and built a defensive network around the city of Bayonne that was the envy of Europe. Bayonne was the key. It was a fortress city sitting at the confluence of the rivers Dour and Nive. It was the shield of southern France. As long as Soult held Bayonne, Wellington could not advance into the heart of the country. This geographical deadlock is what forced Wellington's hand. The British commander found himself in a cramped, miserable position between the mountains and the sea. His army was starving, stuck in the freezing mud of the Pyrenean foothills, unable to forage for food. He could not stay where he was without his army rotting away from disease and hunger. He had to expand. He had to push out to find room to maneuver in villages to house his freezing men. And so, Wellington made the decision that led to the crisis. He decided to cross the Nive. It was a sound strategic move necessary for the survival of the army. By sending Hill to the east bank, Wellington opened up a vast area of the French countryside for supplies and threatened Soult's position from a new angle. But in doing so, Wellington handed Soult a magnificent tactical advantage, one that every military cadet learns in the academy: the advantage of interior lines. Imagine a wheel. Soult and his army were at the hub, inside the fortress city of Bayonne. Wellington and Hill were on the rim of the wheel, separated by the spoke of the River Nive. Because Soult controlled the hub and the bridges inside the city, he could move his troops from one side of the river to the other in a matter of hours. Wellington, on the outside, had to rely on the pontoon bridge miles upstream to move men between the two wings of his army. Soult, sitting in his headquarters, saw the geometry of the battlefield clearly. He saw that Wellington had divided his strength. He saw that if he moved quickly, he could throw his entire weight against one half of the British army, while the other half watched helplessly. The plan Soult devised was classic Napoleonic warfare: destroy in detail. First, he had attacked the left wing of the British army, commanded by Sir John Hope. For 3 days, the French had hurled themselves at Hope's lines in the Arcagnou sector. It had been brutal, bloody fighting, serving as a terrifying feint. Wellington, believing this to be the main assault, had moved his reserves to the west bank to support Hope. This was exactly what Soult wanted. He had lured Wellington's strength to the west. Now, like a fencer switching his guard, Soult used the interior lines of Bayonne to swing his entire striking force to the east. Over the night of the 12th of December, while the storm raged, Soult marched 35,000 infantry and powerful artillery trains through the streets of Bayonne and out onto the road to Saint-Pierre. He was moving the hammer to crush the anvil. The intelligence failure on the British side was absolute. As the sun struggled to rise on the 13th, the British High Command believed Soult's army was still tired and recovering from the attacks on the West Bank. They believed General Hill was facing nothing more than a few screening divisions. They were wrong. The global stakes, the invasion of France, the coalition against Napoleon, the legacy of the Peninsular War, had all narrowed down to a single tactical reality. The French Grand Army, rejuvenated and hungry for revenge, was coiled like a spring. The bridge was down. The trap was perfect. At the center of this geopolitical storm stood Rowland Hill. He was a man of the Shropshire gentry, a man who preferred farming to fighting, a man who wrote letters home about the quality of local livestock. He was not a grand strategist. He was not a marshal of the empire. He was simply a soldier who had been given a patch of ground to hold. But as the global context fades into the background and the focus tightens on that muddy ridge, we realize that the fate of nations often rests not on the gilded tables of diplomats, but on the terrifyingly simple question of whether a few thousand men can stand their ground when the entire world seems to be crashing down upon them. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the impossible was about to be asked of the forgotten man. In the pantheon of British military heroes, there are names carved in granite and cast in bronze, names that echo with the thunder of cannon fire. There is the Iron Duke, Wellington, cold and brilliant, the master of the battlefield. There is Nelson, the tragic, romantic genius of the seas. There is the foul-mouthed, fire-breathing Thomas Picton, who fought in a top hat and swore in a way that made even grenadiers blush. And then, standing quietly in the background, obscured by the smoke of history, is a man with a round, pleasant face, rosy cheeks, and the gentle demeanor of a country parson, General Rowland Hill. To look at him, you would not see a destroyer of armies. You would see a Shropshire squire, a man who belonged in a comfortable chair by a roaring fire, a spaniel at his feet, and a glass of port in his hand. Yet, on that freezing morning of December 13th, the fate of the war rested entirely in his gloved hands. To understand how a man like this ended up facing the wrath of Marshal Soult, we must peel back the layers of the legend and meet the human being the soldiers simply and affectionately called Daddy. The nickname itself tells you everything you need to know. In an army famous for the lash, for brutal discipline, and for officers who viewed their men as the scum of the earth, Rowland Hill was an anomaly. He was a father figure. While other generals were obsessed with glory and promotion, Hill was obsessed with bread and boots. He spent his evenings not plotting his rise in the peerage, but writing letters to the commissariat, demanding better beef for his privates and drier billets for his sergeants. He knew that a hungry soldier cannot march and a wet soldier cannot fight. But more than that, he simply cared. There is a famous story that circulates about Hill, a whisper from the ranks that has survived 2 centuries. It is said that in an entire career of war, amidst the screams of the dying and the roar of the guns, Rowland Hill was never once heard to swear. When a soldier stumbled or a maneuver went wrong, where a general like Picton would have unleashed a torrent of profanity, Hill would simply sigh, look disappointed, and say, "Come, come, my lads, we can do better than this." And the men, shamed by his kindness more than they would have been by any whip, would walk through fire for him. But do not mistake kindness for weakness. This was the paradox of Rowland Hill. Behind the rosy cheeks and the gentle manner lay a mind of razor-sharp tactical acuity and a spine of steel. Born into the landed gentry of Shropshire, the young Rowland was a sensitive child. Family legend has it that he once fainted at the sight of a bleeding finger. It seems almost a cosmic joke that such a boy would grow up to become a lieutenant general in the bloodiest war Europe had ever seen. But perhaps it was that very sensitivity, that acute awareness of pain and suffering that made him such a careful commander. He did not spend lives because he knew the cost of them. By 1813, Hill had become Wellington's right arm. The relationship between the two men is one of the most fascinating studies in command. Wellington was a micromanager. He trusted no one. He famously complained that if he wasn't present at a specific spot on the line, things would go wrong. He held the reins of the army so tight his knuckles were white. With one exception, Rowland Hill. Hill was the only man Wellington trusted with an independent corps. The Duke knew that if he told Hill to hold a position, Hill would hold it until the end of time or until he received new orders. There was a telepathic understanding between them. Hill didn't need the Duke to tell him how to do a job. He just needed to know what the job was. We saw a glimpse of his hidden brilliance 2 years earlier, in 1811, at the Battle of Arroyo dos Molinos. There, Daddy Hill, the cautious defender, turned predator. In a howling gale, much like the one on the Nive, he marched his men in total silence, surrounded a French division that was sleeping in the town, and launched a dawn raid so perfect, so violent, and so sudden that the French commander had to flee in his nightshirt. It was a masterclass in aggressive warfare. It proved that the farmer could hunt. But Arroyo dos Molinos was an ambush. It was a raid against an unsuspecting enemy. What faced Hill now, on the ridge of St. Pierre, was a fundamentally different beast. This was not a raid. This was a stand. For the first time in the war, Hill was truly, terrifyingly alone. Wellington was not just a few miles away. He was severed from the battlefield by the broken bridge. There would be no messengers galloping up with instructions. There would be no reserves coming to plug the gaps. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. For years, Hill had operated in the shadow of the Duke, secure in the knowledge that the great man was nearby to fix any mistakes. Now the shadow was gone. The safety net was gone. Hill had to look into the eyes of his men of the 50th, the 71st, the 92nd Highlanders, and he had to know that many of them were about to die because of his decisions. The father was about to send his children into the meat grinder. As he rode the line that morning, inspecting the positions, the soldiers cheered him. "Good old Daddy Hill," they shouted. He tipped his large bicorn hat to them, his face calm, his smile reassuring. But inside, the turmoil must have been immense. He knew the intelligence reports were wrong. He could see the dust clouds rising. He could feel the ground trembling. He knew that Marshal Soult was not sending a probing force. He was sending a sledgehammer. The tragedy of the forgotten man is that his greatest quality, his reliability, made him invisible. He was so competent, so drama-free, that history often glossed over him. He didn't have scandals. He didn't have feuds. He just did the job. But on December 13th, doing the job meant stopping the unstoppable. We must picture him there at the pivotal moment before the first shot. A solitary figure in a red coat, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, sitting on his horse atop the center of the ridge. He pulls out his pocket watch. He checks the time. He puts it away. He is not thinking of glory. He is likely thinking that the 92nd look a bit thin on the right. He is likely thinking that the Portuguese artillery needs to elevate their aim. He is the reluctance of the warrior personified. The man who fainted at the sight of blood is about to preside over a slaughter. The forgotten genius is about to face his final exam, and the grading curve is survival. The French drums stop beating. The order is given, and Daddy Hill prepares to defend his family. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold on the morning of December 13th, we must step away from the emotion of the battlefield and look at the cold, hard geometry of war. Battles are often decided by courage, but campaigns are decided by maps. And on the map of the French-Spanish border, Marshal Soult held a winning hand that he had been hiding up his gold-braided sleeve. The days leading up to the 13th had been a blur of violence and exhaustion. Since the 9th of December, when Wellington first crossed the Nive, the fighting had been ferocious, but inconclusive. Soult had thrown his men against the British left flank, commanded by Sir John Hope near the coast. For 3 days they had wrestled in the mud of Arcangues and Bassissery. It was a brutal stalemate, a grinding attrition that seemed to have no purpose other than to fill the field hospitals of Bayonne. But it did have a purpose. It was a magician's trick. While the British infantry were dying in the hedgerows of the left flank, Soult was watching the British reserves. He saw redcoat battalions peeling away from the right, marching west to support the beleaguered Sir John Hope. He saw Wellington commit his strength to the coast. Soult had successfully convinced the Iron Duke that the decisive battle would be fought near the sea. But as the sun set on the 12th of December, hiding behind the storm clouds, Soult issued a series of quiet, urgent orders that would turn the entire war on its head. The city of Bayonne sat like a spider in the center of a web. It controlled the permanent stone bridges over the Adour and the Nive, safe behind massive fortification walls. This gave Soult the advantage of interior lines. It is a concept as old as warfare itself, but rarely had it been used with such lethal precision. Imagine a great wheel. The British army was stretched out along the Rhine, separated by rivers and rough terrain. To move a regiment from one side of the British line to the other meant marching miles along the muddy outer circumference. Soult, however, sat at the hub. He could move along the spokes. He could shift his weight from one side of the river to the other in a fraction of the time it took his enemy. On the night of the 12th, under the cover of the torrential rain that deafened the sentries and obscured all movement, the French army began to flow. It was a massive, serpentine movement of 35,000 men. Regiments that had been fighting on the coast at dusk were quietly pulled out of the line, marched through the lit streets of Bayonne, across the secure stone bridges, and out the eastern gates. They were moving from the left wing to the right, swinging the pendulum of war with terrifying speed. While Hill's pickets shivered in the dark, listening to the rain, an entire army was assembling just a few miles away in the blackness. The artillery trains, the heavy 12-pounders designed to smash infantry squares, trundled over the cobblestones, their wheels muffled by the storm. The cavalry sharpened their sabers, the infantry checked their powder. It was a masterstroke of logistics. By the time the first gray light touched the horizon, Soult had achieved local superiority that was almost comical in its disparity. He had stripped his defenses elsewhere to the bone, leaving only skeleton crews to man the walls, gambling everything on this one, crushing blow against Hill. The tragedy for the British was that they were completely, utterly blind to it. The intelligence failure was absolute. Wellington, usually so astute, so attuned to the rhythm of his enemy, had been deceived. He believed Soult had been bloodied and exhausted by the fighting on the left. He believed the French needed rest. The British officers on Hill's front were relaxed, expecting a quiet day of reorganization. The pickets were not reinforced, the reserves were not brought forward, and then the final tumbler of the lock clicked into place. The bridge broke. We have spoken of the bridge already. But we must understand it now, not just as a misfortune, but as the sealing of the tomb. When the pontoons at Villefranche snapped in the surging current, it did not just isolate Hill physically, it isolated him mentally. The psychological impact on a commander knowing there is no way back and no way for help to arrive is a heavy burden. But Hill did not yet know what was coming. He knew he was cut off, yes, but he thought he was cut off from a defeated, resting enemy. He did not know he was cut off in a cage with a tiger. The terrain of Saint-Pierre was deceptive. It looked defensible, a series of rolling ridges and valleys, dotted with farmhouses and thickets. But it was a trap. The main road from Bayonne ran straight through the center, a dagger pointing at the heart of the British position. The ridges were separated by deep, muddy ravines that made lateral movement almost impossible. If Hill's center broke, his wings would be cut off from each other, unable to support the collapse. Soult knew this ground. He had grown up in this country. He knew every dip, every stream, every hedgerow. He positioned his columns to punch through the center like a battering ram. He assigned General d'Erlon, a grim and determined commander, to lead the assault. d'Erlon had 3 divisions of infantry: Derico, Abbey, and Foy. These were not raw conscripts. These were the survivors of the peninsula, men who had marched thousands of miles, men who had a score to settle with the goddams, as they called the British. As the morning of the 13th dawned, the mist played its final cruel trick. It clung to the low ground, masking the buildup of the French forces. Hill's outposts reported only skirmishers. They could not see the deep, dense columns waiting just behind the veil. They could not see the artillery batteries unlimbering, the gunners calculating the range to the British lines with practiced ease. In the British camp, the men were brewing tea, trying to dry their uniforms over sputtering fires. The air was damp and cold. There was the usual morning chatter, the grumbling about the weather, the speculation about when the mail would arrive from England. There was no sense of doom. There was no panic. Then the sound began. It started as a low rumble, felt in the soles of the feet before it was heard by the ear. The rhythmic thud of thousands of boots hitting the mud in unison, the clatter of scabbards, the creak of leather, and then, cutting through the mist, the sound that every British soldier knew and respected, the French drums. Not the slow, steady beat of the British march, but the rapid, frantic, heart-pounding cadence of the pause to charge. The mist began to thin, and there, emerging from the gloom like a nightmare made flesh, was the Grand Army. They came on in columns of attack, deep and narrow, designed to punch through a line by sheer weight of numbers. The front ranks were a wall of blue greatcoats and shakos. The sunlight, feeble as it was, glinted on thousands of bayonets. To the men of Hill's vanguard, the skirmishers of the 92nd and the 50th, it must have looked as if the earth itself was vomiting forth soldiers. The realization hit General Hill with the force of a physical blow. The reports were wrong. The strategy was wrong. The flank was not safe. He was facing a corps with a brigade. The trap had been sprung with terrifying perfection. The jaws were closing and the teeth were made of French steel. Soult, watching from a nearby height, lowered his telescope and smiled. He had done it. He had outwitted the British. He had isolated a fraction of their army and brought overwhelming force to bear. The mathematics of war were absolute. No general, no matter how beloved by his men, could alter the equation of 35,000 against 3,000. The masterstroke was complete. Now, all that remained was the butchery. The morning mist had not fully vanished. It merely retreated, clinging to the hollows and ravines like a reluctant ghost. But as the sun climbed higher, burning through the gray shroud, the battlefield of Saint-Pierre was finally revealed in all its terrifying geometry. To General Hill, sitting atop his charger on the high road, the landscape must have looked less like a battlefield and more like an altar prepared for a sacrifice. The position Hill had chosen, or rather, the position forced upon him by geography, was a ridge of high ground, roughly shaped like a crescent. It was a strong spine of earth running between the River Nive on the left and a stream on the right. In theory, it was a good place to defend. A frontal assault against such a slope is a nightmare for any attacker. But theory assumes you have enough men to man the walls. Hill did not. The ridge was not a continuous, smooth wall. It was broken, jagged, and difficult. Deep, muddy valleys scarred the face of the slope, creating natural lanes of approach that an enemy could use to shield themselves from fire until the very last moment. Worse, these ravines cut Hill's own line into distinct, isolated sectors. A commander on the right flank could not easily see, let alone help, a commander on the left. It was a disjointed, fractured position that required a massive number of troops to secure properly, and Hill had to secure it with a skeleton crew. He began to place his pieces on the board with the cold precision of a man who knows he has no margin for error. On the right, near the village of Vieux-Mugere, he placed General Byng's brigade. On the left, watching the river, was Pringle. But it was the center of the high road, the direct route from Bayonne, the very throat of the British position that mattered most. If the center broke, the army would be cut in half, rolled up, and thrown into the river. Into this meat grinder, Hill placed his most trusted veterans, the brigade of General Edward Barnes. It is here, in the center, that the numbers tell the true story of the impossible odds. While Hill technically commanded 14,000 men across the entire front, the vast majority were miles away, guarding flanks that were not under attack. Standing directly in the path of Durland's advancing tens of thousands were just 3 regiments and a handful of Portuguese allies. First, there was the 50th Regiment of Foot. They were known as the Dirty Half-Hundred and the Black Cuffs. They were hard men, their red coats faded to a dull brick dust pinked by the Spanish sun and the endless rain. They had fought their way across the peninsula, earning a reputation for a grim, stubborn refusal to budge. Next to them stood the 92nd Regiment of Foot, the Gordon Highlanders. They were a spectacle even in the mud, dressed in their kilts of dark green and blue tartan, with the tall black ostrich feather bonnets nodding in the breeze. They were the pride of Scotland. The French feared the ladies from hell, as they sometimes called the kilted regiments, knowing that beneath the strange dress lay a ferocity that bordered on the primal. Supporting them were the Portuguese. We must not forget them. By 1813, the Portuguese infantry, trained by British officers, were no longer the undisciplined rabble of the early war. Wellington called them the fighting cocks of the army. Brigade Ashworth's Portuguese Caçadores light infantry hunters were spread out in the thickets and hedgerows at the base of the slope. They were the tripwire. They would be the first to feel the weight of the French hammer. Together, these units in the center numbered perhaps 3,500 muskets. Facing them, marching up the road with the confidence of a tidal wave, were nearly 20,000 Frenchmen focused on this single point, with another 10 to 15,000 in support. The deployment was a study in minimalism. Hill pulled his main line back, just behind the crest of the ridge. This was a classic Wellingtonian tactic. Hide your strength, protect your men from artillery fire, and present the enemy with an empty hill until the moment of contact. But Hill added his own touch. He placed his meager artillery, just a few 6-pounder guns, on a small knoll commanding the road. He knew these guns would be outmatched. The French were bringing heavy 12-pounders, siege guns that outranged and outgunned the British artillery by a terrifying margin. But Hill needed every second of delay those guns could buy. The waiting is always the hardest part. Veterans will tell you that the battle itself is a blur of adrenaline and instinct. But the hour before, that is where the fear lives. On the ridge, the silence was heavy, broken only by the clinking of ramrods and the murmuring of sergeants telling the lads to steady themselves. The men stood in the mud, checking their flints for the 100th time. The damp air threatened to foul the powder. A wet pan meant a misfire, and a misfire meant you were defenseless. They wiped their locks with rags, shielding them with their bodies, treating their muskets with more tenderness than they would a lover. They could hear the enemy long before they saw them clearly. The deep, rhythmic thrumming of the French drums grew louder, echoing off the valley walls. The Pas de Charge, that rapid, terrifying beat that had heralded the fall of Vienna and Berlin, was now beating for them. Then the French skirmishers swarmed out of the tree line at the bottom of the slope. These were the voltigeurs, the vaulters, agile light infantry who moved like swarms of wasps. They ran forward, took cover behind rocks and bushes, and began to ply the British line with a harassing fire. The first cracks of musketry popped in the cold air. The white smoke began to drift up the hill. General Hill did not move. He sat on his horse near the center, a conspicuous target in his uniform, radiating a calm he likely did not feel. He knew that if he showed fear, the line would crumble. He nodded to Barnes. Barnes nodded to the colonels. The colonels nodded to the captains. The invisible chain of command tightened. The Portuguese in the valley floor began to fall back. They were fighting bravely, firing and retreating, but they were being pushed back by the sheer mass of the French advance. The blue ocean was rising. The distinct columns of French infantry were now visible, dark blocks of men moving with terrifying discipline. They weren't rushing, they were flowing, inexorable and steady. To the men of the 92nd and the 50th, peering over the crest of the ridge, the sight must have been sickening. The valley was full of them, a forest of bayonets, and behind the infantry, the French artillery was unlimbering, the dark muzzles of the cannons turning upward to look at the British ridge. This was the moment of truth. The thin red line is a phrase often used in history, usually to describe the 93rd Highlanders at Balaclava decades later. But here, on the slopes of Saint-Pierre, the line was thinner and the stakes were higher. There was no heavy cavalry brigade waiting to rescue them. There was no fleet offshore to bombard the enemy. There was just a wet ridge, a few thousand tired men, and a general who looked like a country squire. Hill watched the French columns reach the base of the slope. He saw the officers in blue wave their swords. He heard the great roar of Vive l'Empereur rise from 20,000 throats, a sound that shook the very ground. The mousetrap had snapped shut. The deployment was done. There were no more moves to make on the chessboard. All that was left was the collision. Hill turned to his staff, his voice steady, betraying nothing of the dread that must have gripped his heart. "Gentlemen," he might have said, "prepare to receive them." The avalanche had arrived. The transition from the tension of waiting to the chaos of battle is not a gradual slide. It is a shattering of the world. One moment, there is the damp silence of the mist and the beating of a heart. The next, the air itself is torn apart. At Pierre, the sky did not break with thunder, but with the roar of Marshal Soult's grand battery. The French had brought up their heavy 12-pounders, the Emperor's daughters, guns designed to batter stone fortresses into dust. Against the exposed flesh of the British line, they were terrifying. The first salvo signaled the end of the phony war and the beginning of the avalanche. On the small knoll in the center of the British position, the British artillerymen worked frantically. They were outgunned, outranged, and outnumbered. Their lighter 6-pounders barked back defiance, sending round shot tearing into the approaching blue masses, but it was like throwing pebbles at a landslide. The French return fire was immediate and devastating. Great iron balls plowed into the mud of the ridge, sending fountains of wet earth and mangled bodies into the air. The British guns were dismantled, wheels shattered, gunners turned to red mist in the blink of an eye. Within minutes, the British artillery support was effectively silenced. Hill's infantry were now naked. They had no counter-battery fire to protect them. They had to stand and take it, and then, through the smoke of the bombardment, the infantry assault began in earnest. It was a sight that had broken the nerve of armies from Moscow to Madrid. The French did not attack in a thin line like the British. They attacked in columns, massive rectangular formations of men, 40 ranks deep. It was a human battering ram. The psychology of the column was simple. The men in the front could not stop because the men behind were pushing them forward. It generated a momentum that felt unstoppable. General D'Erlon hurled his corps into the center of the ridge. 20,000 men were moving up a slope held by barely 3,000. The first to feel the weight of this human-crushing machine were the Portuguese caçadores, the hunters stationed in the thickets at the bottom of the hill. These men were light infantry, trained to fight in open order, using the hedgerows and trees for cover. They fought with a desperate courage that surprised the French. For minutes that must have felt like hours, the woods at the base of the hill crackled with the sharp individual reports of rifle and musket fire. The Portuguese made the French pay for every yard of muddy ground. But courage cannot stop a tidal wave. The French voltigeurs, the skirmishers swarming ahead of the main columns, flushed the Portuguese out of the woods like game birds. The sheer volume of French fire was overwhelming. Slowly, then rapidly, the Portuguese were forced back. They retreated up the slope, breathless, bloodied, running past the silent red ranks of the main British line. Now there was nothing between the French columns and the ridge but open ground and the dirty half-hundred. The 50th Regiment of Foot stood on the right of the high road. They watched the blue masses emerge from the smoke of the valley floor. The French columns were so close now that the British could see the faces of their enemies, the moustaches, the mud-splattered gaiters, the determined glint in their eyes. The French officers waved their swords, screaming, "En avant, à la baïonnette!" The drums reached a fever pitch. A lesser regiment might have wavered. To see a wall of 20,000 men charging at you is a primal horror that overrides all training. But the 50th did not waver. They waited. This was the secret weapon of the British Army, the discipline to hold fire until it was lethal. At a range of 100 yards, a musket is a lottery. At 50 yards, it is a weapon. At 20 yards, it is a slaughter. General Barnes, commanding the brigade, waited until the French were almost on top of them. Then, the order cut through the din. "Present! Fire!" The volley that erupted from the 50th was a single deafening crack of thunder. A sheet of flame ripped along the ridge. The effect on the head of the French column was catastrophic. The front 3 ranks of the French assault simply evaporated. Men were thrown backward as if hit by a giant invisible hand. The momentum of the charge was smashed. The column shuddered like a great beast that had been clubbed between the eyes. For a moment, the French halted, stunned by the ferocity of the close-range fire. The smoke from the British muskets hung thick and sulphurous in the damp air, creating a blinding fog. Into this confusion, the British poured a second volley, and then a third. But the French were veterans too. They did not break. The men from the rear ranks pushed forward, climbing over the bodies of their comrades, stepping on the faces of the dead to get at the British. The column reformed, like a hydra growing a new head, and surged forward again. The fighting devolved into a ferocious close-quarters brawl. On the left of the road, the 92nd Highlanders were now engaged. The roar of battle was so loud that orders could no longer be heard. They had to be signaled by drum and bugle, or simply by the example of officers standing tall in the fire. The 92nd, the Gordons, poured fire into the flank of the advancing French. The French replied with a ragged, rolling fire that tore holes in the Highland ranks. Men fell silently into the mud, clutching their chests. Others screamed as the heavy lead balls shattered bone. The pristine tartans were soon stained dark with blood and soil. In the center of this maelstrom sat Rowland Hill. He had ridden forward to a point of maximum danger, just behind the lines of the 92nd. His horse danced nervously as bullets zipped past like angry hornets. A cannonball plowed the earth just yards from his stirrup, showering him with dirt. He did not flinch. He did not shout. He sat with a strange, almost unnatural calm, his eyes scanning the smoke, reading the battle not with fear, but with the analytical mind of a professional. He saw the crisis developing. The French were being checked in the center, yes, but their numbers were telling. They were beginning to lap around the flanks of the British regiments. They were pushing up the ravines, threatening to cut the 92nd off from the 50th. The pressure was immense. It was like trying to hold back a bursting dam with your bare hands. Hill knew he had no reserves to speak of. He had committed his hand. He had to rob Peter to pay Paul, shifting a company here, a battalion there, trying to plug the leaks in the dike before the floodwaters burst through. He sent orders to the Portuguese to rally. He sent an aide-de-camp galloping to the right flank to beg General Byng for any spare men, but the avalanche kept coming. Durlan, seeing the British line hold, threw in his second wave. Fresh French columns, drums beating, marched up the slope, stepping over the debris of the first attack. The weight of the assault was cumulative. The British muskets were fouling with soot. The men were exhausted, their shoulders bruised black and blue from the recoil of their weapons, their throats parched by smoke. The 50th were being pushed back, step by bloody step. The 92nd were holding, but they were taking horrific casualties. The line was bending. It was bowing inward under the colossal pressure of the French mass. It was a scene of apocalyptic fury. The screams of the wounded, the roar of the guns, the rattle of musketry, and the shouted curses of the combatants blended into a single, continuous note of horror. And through it all, the rain began to fall again, mixing with the blood to turn the ridge of St. Pierre into a slippery red abattoir. This was the test. This was the moment the French had been waiting for. The British line was thin, stretched to the breaking point. The avalanche had hit the wall. The question now was which would crumble first, the stone or the snow. As the smoke cleared momentarily, Hill could see the French ensigns, the eagle standards bobbing closer and closer to the crest of the ridge. They were 50 yards away, then 40, then 30. The enemy was at the gates. The avalanche was no longer coming. It was here. If the Battle of St. Pierre was a storm, then the British line had, until this moment, been a sturdy oak tree bending in the gale. But even the mightiest oak has a breaking point. As the morning ground on towards noon, with the rain still falling and the mud turning into a sucking crimson clay, the oak began to crack. The crisis did not arrive with a single dramatic explosion. It arrived with the slow grinding inevitability of a nightmare. The sheer physics of the battlefield were beginning to assert themselves. General Durlan, frustrated by the stubborn resistance of the goddams, had poured more coal into the furnace. He fed fresh brigades into the fight, widening the attack, probing for the weak points in Hill's fractured line. The first crack appeared on the right of the high road. The Portuguese troops under General Ashworth, who had fought with such desperate courage in the early hours, were simply spent. They had been the tripwire, the first to bleed, and they had held on far longer than anyone had a right to expect. But their ammunition pouches were light, their muskets were fouled with soot, and their nerves were shredded by hours of close-quarters combat. Under the relentless hammering of the French columns, the Portuguese began to give ground. It was not a rout initially, it was a reluctant yielding of space. But in war, a backward step can turn into a run in the blink of an eye. As the Portuguese fell back, a dangerous gap opened up on the flank of the 50th Regiment. The dirty half-hundred suddenly found themselves fighting not just to their front, but to their right as well. The French, sensing the weakness like sharks sensing blood in the water, began to pour into the gap, threatening to encircle the British center. General Barnes, fighting on foot alongside his men, saw the danger. He tried to refuse the flank, bending his line back to cover the hole, but the pressure was too great. The British line was no longer a solid wall. It was a series of desperate, isolated islands in a sea of blue uniforms. And then, in the midst of this chaos, came the moment that nearly lost the war. Warfare in the age of black powder was a blind business. Once the firing started, the battlefield became a soup of thick, choking white smoke. Visibility was reduced to yards. Commanders often could not tell friend from foe until they were within bayonet range. It was in this blinding fog that tragedy struck. A battery of British guns, perhaps positioned on the far right flank or misinterpreting the frantic signals through the gloom, sought to relieve the pressure on the center. They calculated the range, lowered their muzzles, and fired. The shells did not land among the French. With a shrieking whistle that every soldier dreads, the shrapnel burst directly over the heads of the retreating Portuguese and the wavering flank of the British 50th. It was the ultimate betrayal of the battlefield. Fratricide. To be killed by your enemy is the soldier's risk. To be killed by your own guns is a horror that breaks the spirit. Panic, cold and electric, surged through the ranks. A cry went up, "We are cut off. The guns have turned on us." For a unit already teetering on the edge of exhaustion, this was the final straw. The Portuguese broke. The orderly withdrawal disintegrated into a confused scramble for safety. Men threw down their packs and ran. The panic rippled into the British regiments. The 50th, battered and bleeding, began to give way. The 92nd on the left, seeing their comrades retreat, wavered. The entire center of the British position, the keystone of the arch, was crumbling. From his vantage point, General Hill saw the abyss opening up before him. He saw the gray and red backs of his own men turning away from the enemy. He saw the French columns surging forward with a roar of triumph, their bayonets eager to finish the job. He saw the road to the bridge and the road to the destruction of the army lying open. This was the all is lost moment. In the life of every commander, there is a split second where defeat stares them in the face. Most men blink. They look to save themselves. They order the retreat to save what can be saved. Rowland Hill did not blink. The man who was known for his gentle nature, the daddy of the army, vanished. In his place sat a general of the British Empire. Hill knew that if he sent an aide-de-camp to rally the troops, it would be too late. A message would not stop the panic. Only a man could do that. He spurred his horse, ignoring the protests of his staff, ignoring the storm of lead that was cutting the air around him. General Hill rode directly into the center of the collapse. He did not ride to the rear to organize a new line. He rode to the front into the very teeth of the French advance. It is difficult for us in the modern age to understand the power of personal leadership on a Napoleonic battlefield. Soldiers were not fighting for a flag or a country in the abstract. They were fighting for their officers. To see the corps commander himself, the man responsible for their food, their boots, their lives, calmly riding into the killing zone, had an electric effect. Hill rode straight up to the breaking Portuguese. He did not scream at them. He did not curse their cowardice. He simply placed his horse between them and the French. He made himself a living barricade. He raised his voice, not in anger, but in a tone of supreme, unshakable confidence. He called out to the officers by name. He gestured to the ground with his sword as if to say, "This far and no further." "Stand fast," he cried. "The 92nd are with you. Look, the Highlanders hold." It was a lie. The 92nd were barely holding, but it was the necessary lie of command. The sight of this solitary figure, resolute and unafraid amidst the exploding shells and whistling musket balls, shamed the panic out of the men. The retreat slowed. A sergeant stopped running and turned around, then a captain, then a file of men. The mob began to coalesce back into a battalion. Hill then turned his horse and galloped to the 92nd Highlanders. The Scots were battered, their ranks thinned by the French artillery, their faces blackened with powder. They were inching backward, trading space for time. Hill rode to the head of the regiment. He took off his hat, the rain soaking his hair so they could see his face. He wanted them to see that he was not afraid. He wanted them to know that Daddy was here. "My brave Highlanders," he shouted over the din, "you must not give an inch. The safety of the army depends on you." It was a simple appeal, but coming from him, it was iron. The Highlanders let out a cheer, ragged, hoarse, but defiant. They locked their ranks. They planted their feet in the mud. The backward movement stopped. The line stiffened. But the crisis was not over. Hill had stopped the rout, but he had not stopped the French. Durland's columns were now merely yards away, a massive blue wall pressing against a thin red fence. The British were fighting back to back in some places. The ammunition was almost gone. Men were rifling through the pouches of the dead to find a few last cartridges. Hill remained at the front, a target for every French sharpshooter on the ridge. His horse was hit. His coat was torn by a bullet. Yet he sat there, the anchor in the storm, projecting a field of calm around him. He knew that he had bought them a few minutes. He had rallied their spirits. But spirit alone cannot stop 20,000 men forever. He needed a miracle. He needed a counterstroke. He looked at the 92nd. They were the only unit left with any semblance of order. They were the only card he had left to play. It was a suicide mission, a final throw of the dice. If they charged and failed, the center would vanish and Hill would die with it. But Hill looked at the grim faces of the Scotsmen, and he saw something there. He saw the cold, hard anger of men who had been pushed too far. He saw the embers of a fire that just needed a breath to roar back to life. He turned to the colonel of the 92nd. The time for defense was over. The time for the impossible had arrived. The situation on the ridge had passed beyond the realm of tactics and entered the realm of desperation. The British center was a bruised, bleeding ruin. The 50th Regiment was a shadow of itself, clinging to the hedgerows like shipwrecked sailors to a raft. The Portuguese were reformed but shaken. Their ammunition pouches empty, their bayonets bent, and directly in front of them, looming like a thunderhead that refused to dissipate, was the French corps of General d'Erlon. They were not stopping. The French officers, sensing the British waver, were screaming themselves hoarse, urging their men forward for the final push. The blue columns, though ragged from the climb and the carnage, were still a massive, heavy weight pressing down on the thin red line. They were 50 yards away, then 40. They were close enough for the British to see the whites of their eyes, close enough to hear the terrifying intake of breath before the final charge. General Rowland Hill sat amidst the wreckage of his command. He knew, with the cold clarity of a mathematician, that the physics of the battlefield were against him. A defensive line, once stationary, is a sitting duck for a column in motion. Mass times velocity equals impact. If the British stood still, they would be crushed. There was only one option left. It was an option that defied all military logic. It was an option that, in any war college in Europe, would be graded as madness. When you are outnumbered 5-1, when you are exhausted, when you are nearly surrounded, you do not attack, you retreat. You save what you can. But Hill was not fighting a war college scenario. He was fighting for survival. He knew that the only way to break the momentum of the French column was to meet it with a shock of his own. He had to change the psychological dynamic of the fight instantly. He turned his eyes to the 92nd Regiment afoot, the Gordon Highlanders. They were a sight to behold, even in their ruin. Their kilts were sodden with mud and blood, their tall feather bonnets ragged, their faces smeared with powder. They had taken the brunt of the artillery fire for hours. They had seen their friends torn apart by round shot. They were tired, hungry, and cold. But they were Highlanders. In the lore of the British Army, this meant something specific. It meant a pride that bordered on arrogance. It meant a refusal to be the first to blink. General Barnes, the fire-eating commander of the brigade, saw Hill's intent. He didn't wait for a written order. He didn't wait for a bugle. He rode to the front of the Gordons, snatched off his hat, and waved it towards the French mass. 92nd, his voice cracked over the roar of battle. Charge! What happened next is one of those moments that transcends history and becomes legend. It is the moment where the spirit of an army manifests in a single action. From the ranks of the 92nd, a sound erupted that was more terrifying than any cannonade. It was the skirl of the bagpipes. The pipers, men who carried no musket, only their instrument and their courage, began to play. The sound cut through the damp air, a shrill, primal scream of defiance that prickled the skin of every man on the field. To the French, it was a barbaric, alien noise, a signal that the rules of civilized warfare were about to be suspended. And then the Gordons moved. They did not run wild like a mob. They did not sprint. They marched. They stepped off with the precision of a parade ground review, their bayonets lowered to the charge, a solid wall of steel and tartan moving downhill into the teeth of the enemy. Imagine the view from the French ranks. You are a conscript in d'Erlon's column. You have marched miles. You have climbed a hill under fire. You believe you have won. The enemy is breaking, and suddenly out of the smoke comes this terrifying apparition, a single regiment, vastly outnumbered, walking towards you. They are not firing. They are not shouting. They are coming to kill you with cold steel. The psychological impact was devastating. The French column, which had been surging forward with the momentum of victory, hesitated. The front ranks slowed, unsure of what they were seeing. The rear ranks bumped into them. The great machine of the attack began to stutter. And then, the Highlanders let out the yell. It was the Highland yell, a ferocious, full-throated roar that had terrified enemies from the glens of Scotland to the plains of Spain. It was the sound of men who had accepted death and decided to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. The 92nd smashed into the head of the French column with the force of a thunderbolt. The violence was intimate and horrific. It was bayonet against bayonet, buttstock against skull. The Highlanders, fueled by hours of suppressed rage, fought like demons. They carved into the dense mass of the French infantry. The sheer audacity of the attack, the impossibility of it, shattered the French nerve. Napoleon once said that in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. Nowhere was this truer than at St. Pierre. Physically, the French still possessed the advantage. They could have swarmed the Highlanders, enveloped them, and wiped them out. But morally, they were broken. They could not comprehend an enemy that attacked when it should have surrendered. The French front ranks buckled. Men began to back away from the bayonets of the screaming Scotsmen. The panic that had touched the British only minutes before now infected the French. It spread like a contagion through the packed column. "Sauve qui peut! Save yourselves!" rang out. The great blue beast began to turn. The column, so formidable only moments ago, dissolved into a mob of frightened individuals trying to escape the fury of the ladies from hell. General Hill, watching from the ridge, must have let out a breath he had been holding for 4 hours. He watched the 92nd chase the broken French remnants down the slope, driving them back into the valley from which they had come. It was a spectacular, miraculous reversal of fortune. But the battle was not just won by the bayonet, it was won by the bluff. Hill had thrown his last chip into the pot, and Soult had folded. As the French tumbled back down the hill, leaving the slopes carpeted with their dead and wounded, the firing began to slacken. The storm of noise that had engulfed St. Pierre for half a day began to recede, replaced by the moans of the injured and the triumphant, breathless cheers of the survivors. The 92nd halted at the bottom of the slope, their chests heaving, their adrenaline fading into exhaustion. They looked back up the hill at what they had done. They had stopped a corps. They had saved the army. Up on the ridge, General Hill sat quietly. He did not cheer. He did not posture. He simply took off his hat and wiped the rain from his forehead. He looked at the bodies of his children scattered in the mud, the price of the victory. He knew that this was not just a battle won. It was a disaster averted by the narrowest of margins. The impossible climax had passed. The avalanche had been stopped not by a mountain, but by a pebble made of Scottish grit and the iron will of a quiet country gentleman. The French were beaten. Soult, watching from his hilltop, snapped his telescope shut in disgust. He knew the game was up. He had held all the cards, and he had lost to a man who had nothing but a broken bridge and a brave heart. The day was theirs. But as the adrenaline crashed and the cold reality of the butcher's bill set in, the survivors on the ridge of St. Pierre knew that they had just lived through something that no one back in England would ever truly understand. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked first. The silence that falls over a battlefield after the guns stop is heavier than the roar of the cannonade. It is a silence composed of exhaustion, of shock, and of the sudden jarring return to the world of the living. On the afternoon of December 13, 1813, that silence descended slowly over the ridge of St. Pierre, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the sullen tramp of retreating boots. Down in the valley, the great blue sea of the French army was receding. It was not the chaotic headlong flight of a routed mob, the French were too professional for that, but it was a retreat of utter bewilderment. Regiments that had marched up the hill singing songs of victory were now stumbling back down, looking over their shoulders at the red-coated figures on the crest, wondering how in God's name they were still standing. For Marshal Soult, watching from his command post on a nearby height, the scene was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. He was the Duke of Dalmatia, a man who had conquered kingdoms for the emperor. He had devised a plan that was geometrically perfect. He had achieved surprise. He had brought overwhelming force to bear on a decisive point. By every rule of war written since the Romans, he should be sleeping in General Hill's headquarters tonight, writing a dispatch to Paris announcing the destruction of the British right wing. Instead, he was watching his corps disintegrate against a wall of stubborn Shropshire clay. The humiliation was personal. Soult had often disparaged Wellington, but to be beaten by Wellington's lieutenant? To be checkmated by Daddy Hill, a man with the reputation of a kind uncle rather than a god of war. It was intolerable. Soult saw the math clearly. He had thrown nearly 40,000 men at a position held by scarcely more than a few brigades, and he had been repelled. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a revelation. It proved that the spirit of the French army, that élan that had once swept Europe, was finally flickering out. And it proved that the British infantry, even when isolated, abandoned, and outnumbered, were the most dangerous animals on earth. As the French columns wound their way back towards the safety of Bayonne's walls, the mood in the British line shifted from desperation to a kind of delirious relief. Men who had been fighting for 5 hours without water dropped to their knees in the mud, gasping for air. Officers shook hands with grim, soot-blackened faces. The adrenaline that had fueled the charge of the 92nd began to drain away. leaving behind the trembling fatigue of survival. And then the final irony of the day revealed itself. Far to the rear, near the river, a cheer went up. It started faint and grew louder. The pontoon bridge at Villefranche, the source of all the day's terror, had finally been repaired. The engineers, working like demons in the freezing water, had lashed the boats back together. Marching across the swaying planks came the 6th Division. They were the relief force. They had marched at double-quick time, expecting to arrive at a scene of slaughter. They expected to find Hill dead and the army destroyed. Instead, they marched onto the field to find the battle already won. They were spectators to a victory they had arrived too late to save. As the fresh columns of the 6th Division wound their way up the slopes of St. Pierre, passing the shattered remnants of the 50th and the 92nd, there was a palpable sense of awe. They looked at the piles of French dead in front of the thin British line. They looked at the small number of defenders. The arithmetic of the battlefield was laid bare for them to see. Hill hadn't just held the line until help arrived, he had broken the enemy's back all on his own. But the moment that would seal General Hill's legacy was yet to come. Along with the relief column came the Duke of Wellington. The Iron Duke had spent the morning on the west bank, consumed by anxiety, watching the smoke rise from St. Pierre and unable to influence the fight. He knew the peril Hill was in. He knew that if Hill failed, the war might be lost. Wellington rode up the high road, his face grim, his eyes scanning the carnage. He saw the shattered trees, the churned earth, the debris of the French assault. The Gru Chazalt. He rode up to where General Hill was sitting on his horse, surrounded by his staff. The meeting between the two men was not one of emotional embraces. They were British officers, after all, but in the context of their relationship, it was electric. Wellington, a man who handed out praise as miserly as he handed out gold, looked at Hill. He looked at the French retreating into Bayonne. He looked at the thin line of survivors. He extended his hand. "Hill," the Duke said, his voice loud enough for the staff to hear, "the day is your own." It was a simple sentence, but in the lexicon of the British Army, it was a knighthood. Wellington was acknowledging that this was not his victory. He had not directed the battalions. He had not ordered the charge. He had been a spectator. This victory belonged entirely, uniquely, to Rowland Hill. It was an admission that the subordinate had become the master. "I have never seen such a pile of dead," Wellington remarked later, looking at the slopes where the 92nd had done their work. It was a grim testament to the ferocity of the struggle. As the afternoon light began to fade into the early winter dusk, the magnitude of what had been achieved began to settle over the army. The Battle of St. Pierre was not a skirmish. It was one of the bloodiest encounters of the Peninsular War. The casualties were horrific. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded in the freezing mud. The screams of the injured began to rise as the shock wore off, a mournful chorus to end the day. But strategically, the result was decisive. Soult's gambit had failed. He had played his ace, the interior lines, the surprise attack, the overwhelming mass, and he had lost. He had nothing left to throw at them. The road to the interior of France was now wide open. The psychological dominance of the British Army was absolute. For Daddy Hill, the moment of triumph was likely mixed with his characteristic sadness. He was not a man who reveled in slaughter. As he rode back through the lines, the soldiers cheered him wildly. "Huzzah for Daddy Hill!" they shouted, raising their muskets and shakos on bayonets. He touched the brim of his hat to them, a quiet, grateful gesture. He knew, as they knew, that they had been part of a miracle. They had stood in the fire for hours, isolated from the world, and they had not burned. As night fell, the campfires of the British Army began to twinkle on the ridge of St. Pierre, mirroring the stars that were finally breaking through the storm clouds above. To the north, the lights of Bayonne flickered, where a humiliated Marshal Soult sat in his headquarters, trying to explain to his emperor how 25,000 men had been beaten by 3,500. The map of Europe had been redrawn that day, not by the strokes of a diplomat's pen, but by the stubborn refusal of a few thousand men to accept that they were beaten. The impossible odds had been overcome. The forgotten genius had stepped out of the shadows. And on the muddy slopes of the Nive, the British Army had planted a flag that no storm could ever uproot. The sun set on the 13th of December, not in a blaze of glory, but in a cold, gray twilight that seemed to mourn what had happened on the ridge. The Battle of St. Pierre was over. The guns were cool. The French were gone, but the legacy of that day was only just beginning to settle into the mud, like the blood that now saturated the soil of the Basque country. To walk the field that evening was to walk through a charnel house. In an area of barely a few square miles, nearly 5,000 men lay dead or wounded. The casualty rates were appalling, rivaling the intensity of the sheerest slaughterhouses of the era Borodino or Albuera. The 92nd Highlanders, who had made that immortal charge, had lost a staggering portion of their strength. Their colonel was down, their ranks were decimated. The 50th Regiment had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit for weeks to come. This is the sadness of victory that the poets rarely mention. Strategy is clean lines on a map, victory is a screaming hospital tent in the rain. But beyond the immediate horror, the strategic consequences of the day were profound. Pierre was the hinge upon which the invasion of France swung open. Marshal Soult had gambled his entire defensive strategy on crushing Hill. By failing, he had not just lost a battle, he had lost the initiative forever. The impregnable fortress of Bayonne was now neutralized. The road into the heart of France, to Orthez, to Toulouse, and ultimately to Paris lay open. In many ways, the shot fired by the 50th Regiment that morning echoed all the way to Fontainebleau, where, just months later, Napoleon would sign his abdication. Pierre proved that the French war machine was broken. It proved that the spirit of the Grand Armée, which had terrified the world for 20 years, had finally died in the mud of a damp December hill, stopped by a handful of stubborn islanders. And yet, if you walk the streets of London or Manchester today and ask a passerby about the Battle of Saint-Pierre, you will be met with a blank stare. Ask them about Waterloo, and they will nod. Ask them about Trafalgar, and they will smile. But Saint-Pierre, it has vanished into the mist of history, much like the morning fog that started the battle. Why? Why is a victory of such impossible odds, 3,500 holding off, 25,000 relegated to a footnote? The answer lies perhaps in the character of the man who won it. General Rowland Hill was not a man for the history books. He did not hire publicists. He did not write bombastic memoirs claiming he saved the world. He did not have the flair of a Murat or the tragic destiny of a Moore. He was quiet. He was modest. After the war, he returned to his estate in Shropshire to tend his gardens and look after his tenants. When he eventually succeeded Wellington as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, he did so with the same reluctant competence he showed on the battlefield. History, unfortunately, has a bias towards the loud. It remembers the tyrants and the egomaniacs. It remembers the men who scream. It often forgets the men who simply hold the line. But among the soldiers of the Peninsular Army, Pierre was never forgotten. For decades afterwards, in veterans' clubs and Chelsea pensioner wards, old men with faded red coats would speak of that day with a reverence reserved for holy things. They didn't talk about the strategy. They talked about Daddy Hill. They talked about seeing him on his horse in the storm of lead, calm as a statue, making them believe they were invincible. They remembered the feeling of the impossible. It established a tradition of stubbornness, of fighting best when the maps say you should lose. It is the spiritual ancestor of Rorke's Drift, of Mons, of Dunkirk. It is the belief that numbers are just numbers, but spirit is concrete. Today, the battlefield of Saint-Pierre-d'Iroube is largely swallowed by the suburbs of modern Bayonne. There are houses where the 92nd charged. There are roads where the French columns marched. But if you go there on a rainy December morning, when the mist rolls in off the Atlantic and clings to the ridges, you can almost hear it. You can hear the faint, ghostly skirl of the bagpipes. You can hear the thunder of the 12-pounders. And you can feel the presence of the forgotten general. Rowland Hill died in 1842, beloved by his men and respected by his nation, though never quite accorded the celebrity of his peers. But his victory on the 13th of December stands as his eternal monument. It was a masterpiece of command, a triumph of the human spirit over the cold calculus of war. It was the day the quiet man roared. As we look back through the lens of 2 centuries, we must ensure that the fog does not claim them again. We must remember the 50th, the Portuguese Caçadores, the Highlanders, and their gentle commander. They remind us that sometimes when the bridge is down and the enemy is at the gate and all hope seems lost, that is exactly when the greatest chapters of history are written.